I am so excited to have New England Journal of Medicine's editorial fellowship program as a sponsor for this podcast. Here is Dr. Harleen Marwa, a current fellow, on her experience.
Some of the things that we expected were to really strengthen our muscles, how to interpret scientific literature, get this amazing experience of sitting in on these editorial meetings twice a week where they decide which papers to publish and why. And being part of those conversations has been really fascinating. I think for me, some of the surprising things has been learning a lot of lessons in leadership. And so how do you facilitate navigating those conversations? How do you approach scientific debate? And while thinking really critically about scientific integrity and research, I think that has been just such a useful lesson and experience to gain out of the year. And then to be supported by the work culture at the New England Journal of Medicine. All of the deputy editors here and associate editors and staff are so approachable. There's also all these informal learning experiences, like just watching how they lead conversation and hearing the kinds of questions they ask.
And yes, this is a 1-year full-time paid editorial fellowship. Check out the show notes for the link to learn more about the program and application. And with that, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to Beyond Journal Club, a collaboration between CoreIM and NEJM Group.
The goal of Beyond Journal Club is to take landmark clinical trials and to put them into context, telling us the story of how we got to where we are and what it means for how we take care of patients.
I'm Dr. Greg Katz, cardiologist at NYU.
And I'm Dr. Clem Lee, a former fellow and current editor for NEJM Group.
And my name is Abana Pearl. I'm an editorial fellow at the New England Journal of Medicine and a hospitalist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center with ID training. Today we're going to discuss the Purpose 1 and 2 trials, which investigated the use of long-acting injectable drug lenacapavir to prevent HIV.
Barna, I still so vividly remember this writer's pitch day. When you pitched this trial, you were able to convince a cynical, skeptical cardiologist that talking about HIV prophylaxis was going to be interesting and educational.
Well, I'm glad I did. The Purpose 1 and 2 trials was such a clear pick for me because they represent a huge advance in HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis, aka PrEP.
And it is so amazing to think about how far we have come in HIV care. We used to think that this disease was going to plague humanity forever. And so, like, when I started med school, PrEP didn't exist. And to sort of catch up to where we are and the nature of what science has done to transform a disease that automatically killed you or that you could only avoid by modifying your exposure to a chronic disease that you're able to treat with daily pills and even take daily pills to protect you from getting, I mean, it's astounding.
Yeah, I totally agree. And now the trick is how to give the medications to people in the most accessible way. And that is where purpose trials come in.
And this stuff really matters, and not just for patients abroad. So many people think about HIV as a global health disease, but there are over 30,000 new cases of HIV in the United States each year. To put that into perspective, that's more new HIV cases than acute leukemias in the United States annually.
Yeah, so in today's episode, we're going to start with the basics of what PrEP is.
Then we're going to look at prior PrEP trials and what they've taught us about efficacy, which is how good a medication is in an ideal setting. And we'll compare it to effectiveness, which is how good a medication is when it's used in the real world.
Finally, we'll discuss the purpose trials and see how they have the potential to bridge the gap between efficacy and effectiveness and revolutionize HIV prevention.
Abarna, you're the ID doc here. Can you give us a quick refresher on HIV and the theory behind PrEP?
Of course. The reason why HIV is so hard to cure is that it's an RNA virus that integrates into the human genome, so it never completely goes away, even when you're on antiretrovirals.
And so for those of us who don't have as much experience treating this condition as you might, can you walk us through the mechanism of how PrEP prevents HIV infection?
So the idea of PrEP is that it nips HIV in the bud once you're exposed, and it stops it from replicating in the body.
And the scope of HIV therapy is massive. And so we're going to limit our discussion here to focus solely on the drugs that are used for PrEP. The names can quickly get confusing because each one has an acronym, a generic name, and a brand name. So we'll introduce each drug with its generic name, mention the acronym because that's what you're going to see written in those very detailed ID notes, and then refer to it mostly with the brand name because that's how our patients talk about these drugs.
So, drum roll. First up, we have tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, or TDF, and emtricitabine, FTC. These are both nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors.
TDF and FTC are sold together in a pill known as Truvada.
An important feature of HIV, which is an RNA virus, is that it gets transcribed into DNA. And so drugs like Truvada act as decoys that get incorporated into the growing DNA chain and block the HIV chain from growing further.
So, in the first ever PrEP trial, which was the IPREX trial in 2010, researchers randomized 2,500 adult men who have sex with men, MSM, and transgender women to Truvada or placebo and followed them for a median of 1 year.
There were 36 new HIV infections in the group receiving Truvada for PrEP, compared to 64 in the placebo group. In other words, there was almost a 50% reduction in HIV infection with PrEP. That's pretty huge.
So, in a lot of other conditions, a 50% relative reduction would be amazing. But the results were actually a little bit disappointing in this trial for the study investigators. And those disappointing results, they were expecting a much larger drop, was basically due to adherence challenges.
Yeah, we know that because they actually looked at the levels of Truvada in the blood. And in patients with detectable levels, the reduction in HIV risk was much higher, 92%.
That difference gets at this theme that we're going to keep hitting on when it comes to these drugs. PrEP is really effective against HIV infection, but only when it's actually taken. I mean, what good is a drug that people are not using consistently?
And another theme that we'll see across the PrEP trials, you can't just extrapolate results from a trial in one group of patients, like men who have sex with men, and think that it applies to everyone, like cisgender women.
And it's definitely true that understanding the patient population helps for you applying any type of trial. Reassuringly, in the trials that followed IPREX, daily oral PrEP with Truvada was found to be efficacious across many other patient populations, including those who inject drugs, heterosexual men and women, and heterosexual couples where one person has HIV and the other doesn't.
So it sounds like it was beneficial in different populations, but was it equally beneficial across all these populations studied?
Well, that's a good point. So, unfortunately, many studies have found that PrEP is often not taken as prescribed by cisgender women. And of course, oral PrEP is less effective when doses are not taken consistently.
Some of this is probably just as simple as it's hard to remember to take pills. But also, anecdotally, after talking to some colleagues who specialize in HIV, I learned that there's some stigma surrounding PrEP, particularly in Africa. Apparently, Truvada is called the little blue pill, and using it suggests that you're either unfaithful or promiscuous, work in the sex trade, or already have HIV. That stigma adds yet another layer to adherence challenges of just remembering to take your medicine.
And that brings us to our second option for HIV PrEP, tenofovir alafenamide and emtricitabine, or TAF-FTC, more commonly known to patients as Descovy.
The use of Descovy for PrEP was established for MSM in the Discover trial, which was published in The Lancet, where Descovy was shown to be non-inferior to daily Truvada.
That's right. So in 2019, Descovy was approved for PrEP in men who have sex with men and transgender women. But it hasn't been approved or extensively studied, for that matter, in those who have receptive vaginal sex, pregnant people, or people who inject drugs.
Hey, quick question. Why does the tenofovir and Truvada get called TDF, but the tenofovir and Descovy gets called TAF?
Well, they are pretty similar, and both of them are prodrugs of tenofovir diphosphate, which is the active agent. Truvada is converted to the active agent inside the gut and plasma, whereas Descovy is converted to the active agent inside CD4 cells. So with Descovy, there's thought to be less plasma and organ exposure to tenofovir, and hence a bit less renal and bone toxicity.
Yeah, but as with all of medicine, there's no free lunch. Descovy is linked to other things like hyperlipidemia and weight gain.
Yeah, but Truvada is generally still preferred by infectious disease doctors for the typically young, healthy patients that need PrEP, especially as it's generic and more affordable now.
And so to recap, both Truvada and Descovy are effective in PrEP in MSM and transgender women, and there's data for Truvada in cisgender women and a number of other patient populations. But both of these are daily pills that come with their own associated adherence challenges.
So, since we knew that taking oral medications every day could be hard, the next question was, does on-demand PrEP work?
For people who are not willing or not able to take a preventive medication every day, the thought here is that on-demand PrEP might be more attractive, as it only needs to be taken before and after sex.
To be more precise, you would take 2 pills at least 2 hours before sex, 1 pill 24 hours after the first dose, and a second pill 24 hours after the second dose.
Okay, so a quick rundown on the big trial looking at on-demand PrEP. The IPREX trial in 2015 looked at on-demand Truvada compared to placebo in MSM and transgender women. In the median 9 months of follow-up, there was an 86% relative reduction in new HIV in the study arm.
And following this, the Practitioner study, a prospective observational cohort study, showed that both daily and on-demand PrEP were effective at preventing HIV infections, and that really there was no difference in effectiveness between the two methods.
I can certainly see how on-demand PrEP might make the pill easier to swallow, so to say. But in some ways, to me, remembering to take a pill whenever you think you might have sex might be a little bit harder than just remembering to take a pill every day.
So the next step in improving adherence to PrEP was asking whether we can make longer-acting therapies that stay in the bloodstream for weeks, so avoiding the need to remember to take a daily medication or even an on-demand pill.
Yeah, so cue that intro music for long-acting injectable cabotegravir, also known as Cabenuva, and maybe that music could be Death Cab for Cutie. Get it?
Certainly not your
I
best
don't know
and
if
might
that
be your
works.
worst. Yeah.
So in 2021, cabotegravir, given IM every 2 months, was superior to daily Truvada at preventing HIV infections in MSM and transgender women who have sex with men.
And guess which population they later found it worked in? In cisgender women in sub-Saharan Africa, where taking long-acting injectable cabotegravir was more efficacious than daily Truvada.
Yeah, and it looks like cabotegravir is an integrase strand transfer inhibitor. Bonner, that's a mouthful. Can you remind me what that is?
Yeah, of course. So, just as a comparison, the prior class of medications, Truvada and Descovy, prevented HIV DNA from being made, whereas integrase strand transfer inhibitors like cabotegravir prevent the DNA from actually being integrated into the host CD4 cell genome.
That strategy of long-acting inhibition of DNA integration with cabotegravir was pretty impressive when it was studied. Compared to Truvada, it reduced HIV infections by about 2/3 in MSM and about 7/8 in cisgender women.
But of course, there's a caveat to this one, too.
Yeah, an issue that is being recognized more is that these long-acting injectables could cause delayed detection of acute HIV infections, though so far this has been pretty rare.
The reason why is that when someone gets infected with HIV while they're on a long-acting agent like cabotegravir, the HIV RNA and antibody response is dampened, so the usual HIV screening test is not as good at picking it up.
It reinforces the idea nothing's perfect. So no treatment strategy is perfect. And clinicians on the ground need to really understand the pitfalls and advantages of each one of these treatments to use them all effectively in practice.
Yeah, even though long-acting injectables seem like an opportunity for better adherence, they're still not used very often and really only account for about 2% of PrEP prescriptions in the US. And there are a bunch of reasons why. It costs a lot, we need to have specialized staffing, we need to remind people to come back, there's a lot of insurance issues, and the list goes on.
And I just wanted to throw this out there. There's a fourth HIV PrEP option, a silicone vaginal ring that releases the drug dapivirine into the vaginal mucosa over a month.
Dapivirine isn't really used in the US, but has been approved in several countries in Africa. I'm glad they have this in the PrEP arsenal since in sub-Saharan Africa, women and girls made up 63% of all new HIV infections in 2021.
Wow, that's a lot. So let's recap what we've discussed so far.
Yeah, PrEP can practically eliminate the risk of HIV transmission by sexual intercourse, and is also pretty good at preventing HIV from needle exposure. Of course, that's when PrEP is used consistently. Right now, the most common medications used for PrEP are Truvada and Descovy, which are both tablets and can be difficult to remember to take.
And that led to more research on taking PrEP medications on demand. But to me, it seems more difficult to take an on-demand medication for an unpredictable activity like sex or using drugs than to remember to take a pill every day.
And so that then led to the development of long-acting medications like cabotegravir, which is a win for cisgender women who do not appear to adhere to oral PrEP as well, at least in trials.
And I think this is the right time to emphasize that important difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And remember, the efficacy of a drug is how it performs in the ideal conditions of a randomized trial, where patients are carefully selected and may behave differently because they're being monitored. Effectiveness, on the other hand, is how well a drug performs in the real world. And that's often, but it isn't always, lower than efficacy.
And on that point, in some cases, we actually find that people are more adherent to medications after a trial and FDA approval, since they know that the drug works and is no longer experimental.
This distinction is crucial and is one reason why HIV researchers continue to work on drugs for PrEP, even though we already had evidence they were efficacious. Their real-world effectiveness was way lower due to adherence.
And all of that background brings us to the PURPOSE trials, which studied a long-acting injectable drug called lenacapavir for PrEP.
So first things first, how exactly does lenacapavir work? I'm guessing it's going to have yet another different mechanism of action than the drugs we've talked about so far.
You guessed correctly. So lenacapavir, or Sunlenca, is a novel HIV-1 capsid inhibitor with high potency and a long half-life.
And what makes us think that a specific capsid inhibitor can be effective?
So lenacapavir binds the viral capsid which surrounds the HIV RNA. It prevents HIV's genetic material from actually being released into the host cell, and then it stops that genetic material from getting into the host nucleus. On the other end of the viral life cycle, lenacapavir prevents new viral particles from being assembled.
All of those different mechanisms are why lenacapavir is called a multi-stage capsid inhibitor. And the really long half-life that this drug has when given subcutaneously allows it to be dosed super infrequently, like once every 6 months.
Wow, that sounds pretty miraculous. Are there any downsides that we know of to its use?
So one of the known downsides is that HIV can easily mutate to escape lenacapavir's activity. It actually requires only one point mutation. But hopefully that won't be much of an issue when using lenacapavir for PrEP on a population level.
And so I think that's a good point to transition to what actually happened when we studied lenacapavir in these purpose trials.
Sure. Purpose 1 was a double-blind RCT involving cisgender women in South Africa and Uganda. It compared subcutaneous lenacapavir given every 26 weeks to daily oral Descovy, and then another group receiving daily oral Truvada.
So the participants were randomized in a 2:2:1 ratio to lenacapavir, Descovy, and Truvada. The women in the lenacapavir group received placebo tablets that look like oral PrEP medication, and those in the oral PrEP groups received placebo injections that look like lenacapavir.
Just really quick to point out, Descovy hadn't been studied in cisgender women before, so this is another important feature of Purpose 1.
And patients also received HIV prevention and drug adherence counseling and testing for STIs at each study visit.
The investigators compared the incidence of HIV for each type of PrEP with the background HIV incidence among screened people who were not enrolled in the trial.
I just really want to emphasize the fact that this study was in cisgender women in South Africa and Uganda. In that part of the world, all young women are recommended to be on PrEP, which is different from the US, where heterosexual women are generally not considered at high risk.
Yeah, Barnett, can you tell me more about this background HIV incidence that Greg talked about? The author suggested that this was a novel feature of the trial.
Essentially, since we know that oral PrEP is highly effective, it would have been unethical to test lenacapavir against placebo. But oral PrEP is known to be so effective that you would need to enroll such a large amount of people to show that lenacapavir is better. So instead, they took the people who showed up to screen for the trial but didn't make it into the trial because they already had HIV, and they took those people and calculated the incidence of recent HIV infections as the background HIV incidence.
It's actually a really clever way of figuring out just how good this drug really is. And so with that, let's get into the results.
In the lenacapavir group, there were 0 infections amongst 2,000 or so participants. In the Descovy group, there were 39 infections amongst 2,000 or so participants. And in the Truvada group, there were 16 infections amongst 1,000 or so participants.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, 0 infections does not take complex statistical analysis to figure out that that's really impressive.
Yeah, and to be more specific, the HIV incidence of 0 infections with lenacapavir was significantly lower than background HIV incidence and the HIV incidence with Truvada. And there was also no significant difference in HIV incidence between Descovy and Truvada and between Descovy and the background incidence. This was a novel result for Descovy, which had not been studied in cisgender women before.
So am I correct in interpreting this as basically that Truvada was the same as Descovy, but neither of them were better than taking nothing at all in this population?
That's technically right, but it's not because the oral PrEP doesn't work. It was because of low adherence, which the investigators quantified by measuring levels of the oral PrEP in red cells in a random 10% sample of participants. Adherence to Descovy and Truvada was low and decreased over the course of the study. And most women with new HIV infection had low or no detectable oral PrEP medication in their red cells.
And not to just keep saying the same thing over and over and over again, but it really bears reinforcing that medications don't work when they aren't taken. And lots of people just have a hard time taking a daily preventive medication. Remember, efficacy under perfect conditions is not the same thing as being effective. And in this trial, participants really struggle to take a pill. And this is a group of people selected for a clinical trial actively being studied.
Yeah, that's true. And it looks like this trial had a part 2. Should we talk about Purpose 2?
Right. Well, Purpose 2 looked at lenacapavir in a completely different population. Cisgender men who are gay or bisexual, transgender women, transgender men, and gender non-binary persons. Most trial sites were in the US, but there were also some sites in Thailand, South Africa, and Central and South America.
Yeah, like we mentioned before, the patient population really matters when we're looking at PrEP studies. So in Purpose 2, the median age was 29 years, and a third of participants were younger than 25. 98% were assigned male at birth, and 22% were gender diverse. And most patients, 2/3 of them, were non-white.
Patients in the study were randomized 2-to-1 to lenacapavir versus Truvada. And similar to the Purpose 1 in cisgender women, patients in the lenacapavir group received placebo tablets, and those in the Truvada group received placebo injections.
And also similar to Purpose 1, concentrations of lenacapavir and Truvada were also randomly assessed in 10% of the participants.
Okay, so now let's talk about the results.
Yeah, it looks like there were 2 HIV infections in the lenacapavir group compared to 9 in the Truvada group.
And it's worth noting that those 2 patients actually developed resistance to lenacapavir while on the drug, and that resistance was from an N47D capsid mutation. Remember, it's only 2 infections in a lot of patients. And so most experts think that the benefits on a population level of lenacapavir probably outweigh the risks pretty massively of inducing lenacapavir-resistant HIV.
So then, how did this drug do in this population? The Lenacapavir group had 96% fewer infections than the background HIV incidence and 89% fewer infections compared to Truvada.
Yeah, and actually it looks like Truvada did okay compared to the background HIV incidence in Purpose 2 compared to Purpose 1 when it was basically useless. Do we know why that is?
Right, so in Purpose 2, there was higher adherence to Truvada compared to Purpose 1. This may be because of a different population studied. Purpose 1 was in cisgender women in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Purpose 2 was mostly in men who have sex with men and transgender women in the United States.
So taking that daily oral pill, it's possibly related to that stigma that could reduce adherence in women, but I don't think that we really know why there was such a difference in taking the medications.
Right. All right, Greg, do you want to help us summarize the Purpose trials and what we learned from them?
Sure. So in 2 very different patient populations, the long-acting injectable drug lenacapavir reduced HIV incidence compared to both Truvada and background incidence. And notably, the Purpose 1 trial showed that adherence to oral PrEP was particularly poor in women. And as a consequence, PrEP that they aren't taking didn't appear to prevent HIV at all.
I am so excited to have Shakeology as a sponsor. Like many of you, I'm so busy with all the different hats that we're juggling and want something easy, quick, but also healthy. Set yourself up with a good day with vital nutrients that you get with Shakeology. It's a superfood shake that's really easy to mix with water, or I like it with milk. And honestly, for those days where it gets really busy in the hospital or in between meetings, it really does satisfy me and helps curb any cravings. It's a complete nutrition supplement, so think about getting all your greens, all the antioxidants, really supporting that health, digestion, and energy we all need. Also, it's only got the good stuff, so no added sugar, artificial sweeteners, preservatives, or colors. Shakeology is an all-in-one nutrition shake, and they have a really great deal going on right now. Free shipping, as well as a free shaker cup, plus more discounts. You've got to give these shakes a try. Go to Shakeology.com to get 15% off with the code CoreIM. That's Shakeology.com, code CoreIM for 15% off. And with that, let's get back to the episode. If you're in healthcare, you've probably heard of figs. And if you haven't heard of them, let me just say, total game changer. These scrubs are actually specifically made for us doctors, residents, students, all of us putting in long hours and needing gear that can actually keep up. I remember the first time I saw one of my colleagues walking into a sign-out room looking way more put together after a night shift. And yep, it was figs. And I finally tried it myself. And honestly, they live up to the hype. They're lightweight, they're breathable, stretchy, like scrubs that are actually made to move with you, not against you. The fit is clean, modern, but quite functional. Tons of smart pockets, which I love for all the snacks, zippers that don't snag, and actually antimicrobial fabric that is built for the real clinical life. And it's more than just scrubs. Figs is helping outfit healthcare workers around the world. They have their Threads for Threads initiative, which is awesome. And I love that they give back. So whether you're in the ED, rounding, grabbing groceries post-call, Figs shows up for you. Go to wearfigs.com and use the code FIGSRX to get 15% off your first order. That's wearfigs.com, code FIGSRX. And with that, let's get back to the episode.
All right, so where do these studies leave us?
Well, I'm just left thinking about what a striking result this is. In Purpose 1, in cisgender women, there were no infections in the lenacapavir arm compared to 39 in Descovy and 16 in the Truvada arm.
Yeah, it sounds like this drug could be revolutionary in the world of HIV prevention. The adherence rates were high, it only requires 2 injections a year, and the main adverse effect was injection site reaction. So, in general, it was really well tolerated.
And it's so exciting that this medication seems to be acceptable, particularly in populations like cisgender women in sub Saharan Africa. As we mentioned before, there were many other studies where cisgender women unfortunately had poor adherence to oral PrEP.
So, can we just take a step back for a second? I am totally blown away as I've been diving into the research for this episode. I mean, the game has changed here. We have already had the tools with antiretroviral therapy that turn HIV from a death sentence into a chronic disease. And now we have a whole bunch of tools that can prevent HIV infections in the first place. All of the things that we've talked about on this podcast, this is actually the set of trials that makes me the most idealistic and inspired because it is just so freaking cool that science has figured HIV out.
Preach.
Greg, you're talking like an HIV doctor now. I mean, I agree with you, and I have to say it's remarkable that you've come full circle. I remember when I first brought up this trial at the writer's pitch, you seemed to be the most cynical of everyone about the impact it would have on medicine.
That's fair. It's probably because of how ignorant I was. I mean, since we've been diving into this, I have been thinking about this nonstop. I've been talking about this with people throughout my life. The advances in HIV are so remarkable, and we need to be doing a better job of celebrating how far the science has come.
Wow, I think it really says something when you get a cardiologist excited about infectious disease.
I will take that as both a compliment and an insult. And so thank you, but I'm a little bit offended.
Not to break up this heartwarming moment, but I think we have a few more hurdles before HIV is completely eradicated, right? Like, how do we know lenacapavir won't fall into the category of drugs that are just new and expensive, like cabotegravir, and suffer from poor uptake? Are we worried about this lenacapavir-induced resistance? And what about the difficulty in diagnosing new HIV infections when someone is on such a long-acting drug?
And so, yes, I agree. Every single one of those questions is really important. And we also can't forget about the inequities and who's getting it and who has access. Don't get me wrong. These are gigantic problems and they are serious problems. But I think it's also okay to say we have climbed over this first mountain in HIV with ART and now with PrEP. And now we need to climb over the second mountain of how do we get these medications everywhere.
So let's get into that. Now that we know that lenacapavir works, what should we be thinking about to get it to the people who need it the most?
Well, it's not just the implementation science. It involves a lot of advocacy and policy, and doesn't just fall on the shoulders of individual clinicians and people in their local environments. On a macroscopic level, there are the bigger issues like insurance coverage, and globally, it's low-income countries that bear the highest burden of HIV, but are usually forgotten about when it comes to these expensive drugs like lenacapavir. And really, those countries are where it will make the most impact.
Yeah, and of course, there needs to be political will and momentum to really end the HIV epidemic. The people in power must continue to see HIV as an important problem to overcome.
The policy and advocacy realms are certainly vitally important. And another point is the clinician on the ground perspective. The PrEP solution for each patient is going to be individualized based on their own circumstance and demographics. And so understanding how likely is somebody to be adherent to a daily pill versus how squeamish is somebody about a twice yearly injection, those are important questions to answer. Lenacapavir is incredible, but there are a lot of patients who may be fine taking the cheap and readily available generic oral Truvada.
Yeah, Barna, in a world where lenacapavir is available and affordable to everyone, who do you think will be the most accepting of it?
Well, I would say that people where adherence is a big challenge, who may not remember to take something every day, but can remember to come into the office twice a year. And in certain groups where taking a pill for HIV is stigmatized, maybe like in sub Saharan Africa and women, injections may be more effective in those groups.
Yeah, this discussion reminds me of the editorial by Dr. Lindsay Baden, deputy editor at the New England Journal of Medicine, and former CDC director Rochelle Walensky. It all goes back to effectiveness, not efficacy. How do we choose what is right for each person? And some of that will probably be based on what somebody's sex is and who they have sex with and what their risk factors are. But some of it is honestly going to be how likely is this person to come into their appointments? And if somebody's not going to come to twice yearly appointments, maybe they're better off without lenacapavir.
Yeah, I can see the same issues with efficacy not translating into effectiveness with oral PrEP, also affecting this long-acting medication. But Greg, can I be idealistic for a second?
I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that or that our listeners do either. Everyone's so used to both of us being pretty cynical, but go for it.
Hear me out. I imagine when this first rolls out, it will be in the hands of ID docs like Abarna. But I am envisioning a world where it doesn't have to be. The primary care doctors in the US are so used to setting up annual or semi-annual injections and infusions. They do this for IV iron, depo-progesterone, or IV bisphosphonates. So I'm really hoping that the more we talk about it and stress its importance, maybe the PCPs will take up the mantle for lenacapavir as well.
And that all starts with people knowing how good these medications are and understanding that we have this enormously successful suite of tools. Like all new drugs, lenacapavir is going to be really freaking expensive and almost nobody's going to be able to afford it at first. But the nature of this stuff is that prices come down as time goes on, hopefully sooner in lower and middle income countries. And so maybe today, April 2025, almost no patients have these medications accessible to them. But pretty soon, lots of people are going to be able to get lenacapavir.
And I think that's a really bright note to end on. So now we will task you, the listeners, with spreading awareness about PrEP to bolster its use and to ensure that everyone everywhere can access the life-saving medications that science has made available.
And that's a wrap.
That is all for today. We thank you so much for listening. And so if you're the type of person that's gotten value from this podcast, please share it with some of your colleagues who you think also might get something out of the episode.
And we thank our reviewer, Dr. Lindsay Baden, for his work on this podcast. And we also thank Dr. Jimin Huang for the accompanying graphics.
Opinions expressed are our own and do not represent the opinions of any affiliated institutions.
I completely sympathize or empathize or whatever. It's very confusing. And many first-year infectious
whatever. I completely sympathize or whatever.
I always get those confused, just like the HIV medications.